welcome everyone to this month's Jyotish Journey webinar associated with the article Places Where Planets Die on Maraka, Karaka, Sthanas. And by the way, I'll be referring to Maraka, Karaka, Sthanas as MKS going forward because it's kind of a mouthful. So let's begin by just quickly reviewing what are said to be the MKS positions of the different grahas. So for the sun, anyone?
12th house.
12th house. For the moon?
8th house.
8th house. For Mars?
7th house.
7th house. For Mars? Mercury?
7th house.
7th house.
7th house. Some say 4. Most say 7. Jupiter?
3rd house.
3rd house.
3rd house. Venus?
6th house.
6th house.
6th house. Saturn?
1st house.
1st house.
1st house. And finally, Rahu?
9th house.
9th house.
9th house.
But of course, what I was making a big point of in the article is that to just judge these planets as being ones that are going to give very unfavorable results, just based on this factor alone, you'll go wrong. Any result that a planet's going to give will be a synthesis of a whole set of factors related to that planet, right? And so we can't judge at a single factor. We have to do that synthesis. Now, which is not to say that I believe this concept is somehow invalid or there wasn't some underlying value to the idea. I believe there is, but again, you just can't go by that alone, as I attempted to illustrate and demonstrate in the article. But there will be at times when such a position combined with other factors are certainly going to be an ill placement for that particular planet. So let me start sharing screen here. And people can tell me when a chart appears, please.
Mark, we can see you.
Okay. So this is the chart of a very famous spiritual teacher who was one of my spiritual teachers. He brought out into the world what he called transcendental meditation. It was quite a phenomenon worldwide. He became quite world famous for his teaching of this and the organization he developed and the teachers that he trained to teach others, one of which I was. This was way back in the late 1970s. So Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And so which planets in his chart would occupy MKS positions?
The sun.
The sun, obviously, because it's in the 12th house, and then also
Moon.
moon, because it goes to the 8th. But again, when we do this synthesis of looking at different factors about it, and he did, by the way, run both the sun major period, which you can see he ran from ages 21 to 27. And then following that, of course, would have been the moon period from 27 to 37. So actually he had 16 consecutive years of these grahas. So what would be considered as favorable about this sun, if anything?
Expected by Jupiter and with Venus.
So it's I heard someone say it's Vargotama. First of all, it's very, very strong, right? It's at the very last degrees of Sagittarius. That puts it in Sagittarius, both in the birth chart and the Lamsh. So it's Vargotama. It can give its results quite strongly. And then Udiant mentioned that it's under the influence of two benefics, Jupiter. And, Jupiter here is its sign lord. So, you all heard me talk about how there's this kind of sambandha that is as strong as sambandha as things like conjunction or mutual glance or even exchange. When a planet is in the sign of some planet and then aspected by planet, and the best kind of situation this can be is when a planet's falling in Jupiter's sign aspected by Jupiter, which is what we have here. And then consider the additional influence of Venus, who of course is not only a natural benefic, but who's a very good planet for this Lagna, being the Yoga Karaka. So somebody needs to mute we're having conversations going in the background. Please mute your mic, everyone, if you're not making a comment. Thank you. So we have the 2 points that Sun is very strong. Vargotama, it gets the influence of both benefics, one of whom is its sign lord, and then one of whom is the Yogacaraka planet. So now you immediately have a question?
Yes, Mark, I noticed it. The sun is in its own nakshatra.
So an additional favorable point, thank you, would be that the sun's in its own nakshatra. So actually there's a lot of really good things going on with the sun. And then what yogas would it form, or what yogas would it give the result of?
Asarala Yoga.
So good, Rui. You see that it's the 8th Lord in the 12th, which gives one of those Viparit Raja Yogas. It's referred to as Sarala Yoga in Paladipika. So there is that to consider. And what else? So how else would we judge this sun in terms of the kind of results it could give?
It giving an angle trine Raj Yoga from Chandra Lagna.
So if you evaluate this from Chandra Lagna, actually it becomes quite a interesting conversation, or quite a remarkable yoga, and quite an interesting one to consider, because now the sun is a Vargotama Lagna Lord, and Venus is the 10th Lord, and they're forming in the 5th house. And we'll come back to that when we talk about some of the results that the sun gave. But that is interesting to note. But just based on some other principles.
Sun as the 8th impressionable lord will give the effect, because it will give the effect of the planet that is conjunct or aspected, will give the Raja Yoga that Venus gives.
Very good, very good, Ekaterina.
The 10th lord, yes.
So we know that for Capricorn Lagna, the taint or the blemish of the sun's lordship of the 8th is considered not as great as with other 8 lords. Plus, it becomes what my teacher referred to as a pure impressionable. This is a principle also right out of Parashara that will then, it'll give the results of the stronger house lords with which it's associated. Stronger means strongest in terms of, angle lords, trine lords, and in that sort of order. So in which case here, the sun being with Yogacaraka Venus is giving the results of that Venus in its periods and subperiods. And then, so Raja Yoga is forming in the 12th house. What can they be good for? What can they result in that would be a favorable, positive thing?
Spirituality.
Success in foreign country.
Right. Success in foreign country, and he got his initial fame outside of India, and actually they spent most of his time as a spiritual guru outside of India, and established centers literally all over the world. Eventually, the headquarters of the organization that he developed was headquartered in Europe, the Netherlands. So yes, these combinations definitely gave that result. This was particularly happening in the Rahu period, which I'll come back to. What is noteworthy about this Rahu?
Vargotama.
It's
In a
Vargotama,
sign of a benefic. Aspected by benefic.
With another benefic. So these very combinations, when most of you would have read my article about Rahu, conditions under which Rahu can give some very favorable results certainly apply to this. So I'm throwing this up as an example again, where judging the sun as being a Maraka Karaka Sthana planet, meaning ill-placed and highly unfavorable, would be a considerable misjudgment, right? So what happened in the sun period? He was a student of physics in college at the time when he met a very renowned spiritual luminary, a man, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, who had recently been made the Shankacharya of Jitor math. It's like equivalent to being like the Pope or one of the popes in India, very high spiritual, ecclesiastical, what am I trying to say, spiritual office, you might say. And why could the sun by what principle of Jyotish? I once wrote an article called Jai Guru Dev about periods that can bring a guru into your life. Why could the sun bring a guru in your life, and particularly a very renowned one?
It's 9 from Jupiter and aspected by Jupiter.
Good. So using Karaka Jupiter as a Lagna in Aries, the sun, you'll see, goes to the 9th from there. Of course, it's also strongly under Jupiter's influence, being in Jupiter's sign aspected by Jupiter. But then what happened is basically he dropped out of college, much to his parents' chagrin, and became a disciple of this guru, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, and entered his ashram and became a brahmacharya, became one of his monks. You can see this is happening because the sun, of course, is in the 12th house. And he actually obtained a position within the ashram. He became the secretary, you might say the personal assistant, we would call it these days, the personal assistant of Brahmananda Saraswati. And therefore was in it gave him a position, you might say, and a prominent one within the ashram. So you see what kind of results that the sun is giving here, and wouldn't really be considered much in terms of this idea of MKS. So I wanted to show another example of that. Now, if you see what happened then later, of course, he runs this Rahu period. This is when he became this sort of world famous guru, and TM was kind of almost like a world life phenomenon at that time. At one point, 23,000 people a week were being instructed in transcendental meditation. He was appearing on the covers of major magazines. He was appearing on the major talk shows here in the US. So that the height, you might say, of his fame as a spiritual teacher and of transcendental meditation was happening in the Rahu period. Guess in what 2 sub-periods that was at its height? In what
Rahu Sun.
Say it again.
Rahu Sun, maybe, Mark, because of they're together in Navamsa too.
It was Rahu Sun activating the yogas that we talked about, but then the previous sub-period, Rahu Venus. So you saw, you have consecutive periods, Rahu Venus, Rahu Sun, which was from 1973 up to 1977, about a 4-year period. This is when it was really at its height as a phenomena in his fame, and the publicity surrounding him in transcendental meditation was at its height, quite predictable. So you can see the sun, what kind of results the sun is actually giving. Now coming back, to the moon period, what would be considered to be a favorable thing about this moon?
It's fairly bright.
It's waxing, it's waning, but it's more than half full, so it's still a reasonably bright moon. What else?
Aspect of Jupiter.
The best thing about it gets this aspect of Jupiter. And see, again, it's, you might say, its connection to the 12th house, 12th Lord, because its dispositor, the sun, is in the 12th house. And of course, Jupiter itself is the 12th Lord, aspecting it. And really not too much is known in terms of specifics as to what was happening for him in the moon period. But what is known is that after his teacher died, which I believe was in the moon period, he then basically started living in a cave in the Himalayas, in what's called the Valley of the Saints, and basically doing an enormous amount of yoga sadhana during that time, and can't be known for sure, but presumably experiencing states of samadhi and so on and so forth, which is one of the more esoteric meanings of the of the 8th house. So again, I would not consider this moon and its condition here, just being in the 8th house, as being one where you would immediately presume that this was a very, very bad period, and particularly one in terms of his mental and emotional health. it could have actually been quite the opposite. Although, there's no information absolutely for sure about that. So again, this is an example of two planets in MKS that I think you would misjudge if you would just see them as being ill-placed and not giving good results just based on this factor alone. Why I have the chart up here, some of you maybe heard me write about or comment about this chart before. Contrast the moon period with the Mars period. So what, he moves starting in, so the moon period ended in 1954. He moved into the Mars period. So contrast it, and then, what kind of results would you see Mars giving and what?
Maharaja.
Well, of course, so Mars here, its condition, of course, it's in its exaltation sign. And it's combining with Mercury as the ninth lord. Ninth lord in the first, giving directional strength, he was a guru. And the combination of Mars and Mercury are an angled trine combination. They're also, but then the mutual glance with the Lagna Lord Saturn, of course, getting directional strength. They form rather substantial Raja yogas. And, as the story goes, he started having this persistent thought that he should come out of the cave and go out into the world and start fulfilling the mission of his own guru, which was, spiritual development of the population. And that's what happened. And, this whole thing started to unfold around him, where he then became a very prominent spiritual teacher worldwide, which all started in the Mars period, predictable from that standpoint. So coming back to the moon, from one standpoint, the moon as the seventh lord wouldn't give what? Or why would this moon,
Not give marriage.
It wouldn't give marriage. And why would you say that?
Just in the 8th house, not a very good house. 7th lord in the 8th, and Saturn in the 7th house.
And
They're
then,
aspected by exalted Mars.
right. So this moon is the 7th lord in the 8th, while there's the natural malefic Saturn in the 7th, and Mars aspects to both the 7th and the 7th lord. He was a monk. He was a sannyasi. He never married. And so, depending on how you view that, the moon's position here could be seen as being an ill placement, but he never wanted to marry, right? So
Can we also say, Mark, that moon's degrees is very close to Mars degree, and hence that factor of the 7th house was destroyed?
Well, if you're asking me, are closer aspects more intense combinations and therefore give, more intense results, I would say generally yes. You're talking about the fact that Mars is at 9 and the moon is at 9 is an exact aspect. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you heard my answer. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So any thoughts or questions before we move on from looking at this chart?
Mark, it's 10th lord in the 12th, giving a Dur yoga.
Well, yes and no. What he's referring to is that when the 10th lord goes to 6, 8, or 12, but what's missing here from it really being a Dur yoga? There should be the additional influence of natural malefics onto the 10th house, 10th lord. Now you would see Rahu here, but Rahu being in the sign of benefics with 2 benefics does not really count. And so there's no Dur yoga here because there's no additional influence of natural malefics. As we said, what this 10th lord and the 12th involving in substantial, highly powerful, potent Raja yogas has meant is that he had great fame in a foreign country.
Yeah.
Is it clear?
No, that's what I asked. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Anything else before we move on? All right. So I'm going to pull up a chart of Charlie Chaplin, obviously a very famous performer performing artist. And I'm doing it with a certain purpose in mind. Where is it? Here it is. I mentioned at the beginning of the article that sort of what inspired me to write this article was a presentation I saw by another Jyotishi on this concept of MKS. And they use different charts to illustrate it. Some of which I would have agreed with is that, you know, they provide an illustration of it. Some of which I was surprised because I didn't think they really provided an illustration of it. And this was one of those charts. So what are the MKS planets, or potentially MKS planets, that are in this chart?
Jupiter, Rahu, and Mars.
Right. So you have Jupiter in the 3rd house, you have Mars in the 7th, and you have Rahu in the 9th, all of them being said to be MKS positions for these planets. But she was using it specifically to illustrate Mars in the 7th. Now, what surprised me about this is that Mars being the 7th Lord in the 7th house here, by itself, in my experience, would actually be the antithesis of an ill placement for Mars, because of course Mars here would be the 7th Lord in the 7th house. But of course there's a lot more going on with this Mars than just it being the 7th Lord in the 7th house. Some of it favorable, but something in particular extremely unfavorable. What would I be referring to?
Tight aspect from Saturn.
Right. So all these planets in the 7th house, including Mars as the 7th Lord, and you know, she was just, one of the students was just asking me a question about, you know, the degrees of the planets in terms of when they make an aspect. Look at Mars at 21 degrees, 7th Lord in the 7th house, and then look at Saturn, 21 degrees. It could not be more exact. Now, of course, Saturn is the good yoga Karaka planet for this minute, but that doesn't change the fact that the 7th house and the 7th Lord and Karaka Venus, all the factors you might say that we evaluate when we're talking about a person's relationship life, are all under the influence of this Saturn, again, in very tight degrees. Karaka Venus is also rather in a close aspect of Saturn. So, you know, she was pointing to the fact that, you know, his love life was, you might say, legendary, and not necessarily in a good way. He was married 4 times. He had numerous affairs. He was accused of having relationships with underage women. He was involved in a famous paternity suit that he lost to one of these women. In other words, and he got a lot of scandalous publicity, you might say, related to his relationship life. And this presenter was saying that, you know, this is because of Mars being in his 7th house. I beg to differ. You know, I don't believe it had to do anything with that at all, but it had to do with these other factors, you know, particularly this influence of Saturn on the 7th house, 7th Lord, and Karaka Venus. And this is what produced the kind of experiences that, the kind of karma that manifested in terms of his relationship life. But that's, you know, by the way, this is, this birth time is, you might say, not based on a written record, but I've worked on this chart extensively because he was had a very interesting life history. And in terms of going through many, many timings of events in his life, and just what his life experience was in general and who he became and all that sort of thing. And I have absolutely no doubt, I'm like 100% certain that this Lagna is correct. In other words, he's Libra Lagna. I cannot speak for the divisional charts and whether their Lagnas are correct, but I'm not really going to be, you know, referring or utilizing him here that much in terms of our discussion. This is his birth chart. Now, you see that he started life in his Rahu period. First 3, almost 4 years of his life was the Rahu period, which is this planet that's in a MKS position, right? Now, I had given, you might actually recognize, if you remember the chart of Adolf Hitler, he was actually just born some days, I think, either after or before, I couldn't forget which. And so many of the, including the Lagna, many of the planetary placements are exactly the same. The only differences are Mercury is not in Aries, as it was in the case of Adolf Hitler's chart, and the moon is not in Sagittarius, as it was in Hitler's chart. So my point is that, you know, both had this Rahu in its Mula Dracona sign in the 9th house, but of course in Hitler's case, Mercury was in the 7th, forming all these really significant Raja yogas. That's not the case here. And so what sort of yoga would this be forming? It's one of the bhava yogas that's given in Paladipika, which is an unfavorable pattern with regards to the 9th house. Anybody have any idea what I'm referring to? So when the 9th house has a natural malefic, and then the 9th lord goes to 6, 8, or 12, then this is referred to as Nirbhagya Yoga. Nirbhagya Yoga. Nir means no, Bhagya means fortune or luck, and it's a negative pattern with respect to the 9th house. And when, you know, one is being activated in the dasha sequence, it can bring ill fortune, ill luck. He was born into very bad circumstances. His mother was a mentally unstable person who was at times had to be institutionalized for going into psychotic episodes, and eventually was permanently institutionalized. Him and his father, his mother and father, I think at age 2, before he moved out of the Rahu period, they separated. Didn't actually divorce, but they separated and were estranged from each other. His father was a severe alcoholic who did not provide financial support to the family and eventually died of cirrhosis of the liver at age 38. So you see Rahu, you know, in the 9th house here. The big difference between his chart and Hitler's chart is the kind of results it gives based on its dispositorship, which is what? Who's Rahu's dispositor and what's not good about it?
It's debilitated.
Well, it goes to the 6th house.
Yeah.
And it's the debilitation sign. And would anyone see any factor that would bring about sort of cancellation of the debility?
Yes, the Venus, because it exalts in Pisces, and it is in Kendra from the ascendant and from the moon.
Well, hold on there. Think about that, Ekaterina. Who's exalted in, is Mercury exalted in Pisces?
No, there are two ways for the cancellation to for the Nichabanga to be cancelled. One is when the dispositor of exaltation, dispositor of the planet itself. So in this case, we can see it's Mercury. Mercury exalts in Virgo. But then we can see another way is to see which planet exalts in that sign the debilitated planet occupies, and Venus is exalted in Pisces. I mean, there are two ways to see this exaltation.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not sure, Ekaterina. You know, Venus is Jupiter's exaltation sign lord, not Mercury's.
But what it is Mercury is in very close degrees to Venus. And I remember one of your previous, when they're very close degrees, they do impact in certain ways. Would that be the case then, Mark?
No, if you're talking about Kendra Sambandha. So think about the different ways in which an exalted or a planet gets its stability canceled. It's not with a exalted planet. It's not with its sign. Not with its
sign. It's a 12th lord sitting in the 6th. That's one way.
It's not in Kendra from the moon or from the ascendant.
Right. It's not in a mutual glance with another debilitated planet. Now, later on, when we talk about the kind of results that Mercury could give as a major period, you know, there's some principle that applies to Mercury here as a debilitated.
It's in its own nakshatra, Revati.
Yes, it's in its own nakshatra, but that's not a factor for cancellation.
It's this dispositor is Mula Trikona.
Yeah, its dispositor, is Mula Dracona, but its dispositor is not falling in an angle from the birth lagna or from the moon. Now, if you're asking me, do I think that Jupiter, its dispositor being strong as Mula Dracona, does that, you might say, help the kind of results that Mercury could potentially give? I wouldn't disagree with that, but I'm not, unless I'm missing something, folks, I'm not seeing any, you might say, classical factor for Nietzsche Banga here.
But Mercury is a Raja giving planet because of the exception.
Yes, well, if you're talking about the Prashra exception, as my teacher referred to it, it's a debilitated planet in the Dushtana, while at the same time, the Lagna Lord is strong in the Lagna, aspecting onto the Lagna. And, as we'll see when we look at the Mercury major period, this is one of those periods when he, had great worldwide fame and success. The fact of his life, though, was that in Rahu, he was born into and lived in very impoverished circumstances. Him and his elder half brother, when his mother would have to go into mental hospitals, essentially, they got sent to what was called workhouses, London workhouses, and they were being educated in what's called pauper schools, right? Something about this Rahu here, it gets this aspect of Jupiter, but what? I mean, what do we know about this Jupiter?
It's not a good planet for this Lagna.
It's not a good planet at all. In fact, it's considered the worst functional malefic. And I know, students of mine that I have this discussion with, they struggle with this all the time. It's paradoxical that Jupiter could be a strong natural benefic and then, of course, aspecting as a strong natural benefic, but can also be a strong functional malefic whose influence on the ninth house and this Rahu from one side is not favorable at all. It's something of a paradox. But then, in terms of this Jupiter being an MKS planet, I'd used the example in the article of somebody with Libra Lagna with Jupiter in its own sign here. He moves into Jupiter at age 3 and runs to age 19. I don't know if anyone's looked into the history of Charlie Chaplin or not, but he started performing and being involved in touring with performing troops at a very, very young age. I think he made some of his first stage appearance like at age 9 or something like that. And then by the age of 14, when his mother was permanently institutionalized, he was basically out on his own, earning his living as a performer. And actually by age 19, he was actually viewed as being kind of like the star of the show of these vaudeville touring shows that had even done a tour of the US. And so you can see here that, at least from one standpoint, this Jupiter as the third lord in the third house of the performing arts, dance, and he was considered to be an incredible mime, comic, as we all know. This is where his initial success came from. So again, I wouldn't necessarily see this Jupiter as being one that's ill-placed here, obviously. And then, of course, he moved into the Saturn major period, which then, what would you predict for the Saturn major period and why?
Again,
So
Raja.
Yoga Karaka for this Lagna?
Yeah, of course, it's, and because the moon is in the Lagna here, of course, this means Chandra Lagna and the birth Lagna are the same. And so the whole patterning of the chart is consistent. It's not, you're not looking at the different perspectives. And so from both Chandra Lagna and from the birth Lagna, you have Saturn as the Yoga Karaka planet placed in the 10th house. And this is when he began, achieving just worldwide fame. Charlie Chaplin was just quite a phenomenon in the 1920s. He, when he developed this character of the tramp, this became sort of his signature character. And he was just enormously famous. To get you an idea about this, at age 26, a studio gave him a contract, which, and again, this is back in the early 1900s, a contract that it was worth $670,000 a year. He was one of the highest paid people in the world, and he was 26 years old. It's one of the greatest, you might say, rags to riches stories of all time, given the extreme poverty that he was born into. And this, by the way, happened in Saturn and Venus. So we haven't really talked about the yogas yet that are forming along his 1-7 axes, but what would you say about, in terms of why Venus, as a sub-period within the Saturn major period, could give him such a lucrative contract?
It's because Venus is with an exalted sun in the 7th house and also with Mudrik on Mars, aspected by Saturn at the same time. I remember you also highlighting that whenever a person runs Saturn Venus or Venus Saturn dasha, either they go really high or really low. So it's either one extreme to the other.
Well, it can, you know, the prince becomes the pauper becomes the prince. You can't go by that invariably, but that is part of the reputation of that period and sub-period. But I'm talking specifically about how does Venus as a sub-period give him such a lucrative contract? In what way?
Mark, it's causing Chandramangala Yoga because Venus is an impressionable 8th lord and giving the result of Moon and Mars.
Well, you know, I would accept that as being part of the answer, but really it's much more straightforward than that.
From Dasha Lagna Saturn, this Venus is in the 10th house with all this exalted Sun and Mars, and they also, from Dasha Lagna also, they form with Moon this Raja Dhyana yogas.
Well, the fact that, you know, he was reaching sort of a career peak in certain ways in the Venus sub-period because of these planets now are all falling. You know, think about what these planets come from Dasha Lagna. Mars becomes a Yoga Karaka, 10th lord in the 10th house. You know, the sun, you have exalted there, and Venus, Mars and Venus would be forming an angle trine combination. But folks, just think of the just think of the Dan yogas that are being formed by the planets in the 7th house, including Venus. Venus is a trine lord, first lord. Mars is the 2nd lord, and the sun is an exalted 11th lord. So that's a 1, 2, 11 combination with, of course, the planets all in strength. What is Venus's source of strength? Mars is an obvious source of strength. It's in its own sign. The sun is exalted, an obvious source of strength. What about Venus?
It's in its own nakshatra.
Venus is in its own nakshatra. Yes, you know, this isn't really, you know, it's a favorable thing, folks, but I think, I don't know if it's correct to consider that a source of strength. It's not like the planet being in, let's say, its own sign. Again, I'd say it's favorable, but I wouldn't say that that's a source of strength.
An exchange in D9.
Right. If people see Navamsha, you'll see that the Mars has an additional source of strength because it's in an exchange, and then Venus has this source of exchange. So my point is that these are this combination of Venus is the 1st lord, Mars is the 2nd lord, Sun is the 11th lord. They form very potent Dan yogas that then gave that result in a Venus sub-period. He also married for the first time at that time, which is a rather obvious result too, given Venus placement in the 7th with the 7th lord. Didn't last long. Again, this aspect of Saturn. But now, you know, it is interesting to consider the Mercury period, because now.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Okay.
Mark, did Saturn period bring any health conditions?
Not that I'm aware of, and you would say that because of Saturn's aspect on the Lagna Lord, while the Mars also afflicts?
Yeah, and also from Dasha Lagna, it becomes the 7th and 8th lord in Serpa Drekna?
Well, those are considerations, but the answer is I just don't know.
All right, no problem.
Not any major ones or serious ones, because I just this morning read a lot of biographical material about them, and this wasn't mentioned. You know, this Mars-Saturn combination, think about what's going on here, folks. I mean, what's the good, you know, obviously they're both malefics and they're causing afflictions to, you know, things, but what are they also forming here?
Mutual aspect.
Well, but by their mutual aspect, what then is happening?
Raja, 5th and 7th.
Well, yes, Mars is an angle lord and Saturn is a trine lord. So that's an angle trine combination, but Saturn is also a trine lord, as a trine lord, and Mars is a second lord. I want people to see that, you know, this mutual glance, this very close mutual glance, forms both a Raja and Dhan yoga. Now, he was really just like a global phenomena that was going on. And there was, you know, Charlie Chaplin merchandise. His character, the tramp, was, you know, being used commercially in a lot of different ways, and so on and so forth. He was just a very big deal. But I want to come again to the Mercury major period, because you know, these Raja yogas that form in an unusual way, based on this idea of planets in the debilitation sign in Sthanas, while the Lagna Lord is in the Lagna or aspecting the Lagna, they will give Raja Yoga, as I've, you know, sort of repeatedly illustrated in my articles and books and so on. But they can come with a lot of other problems and difficulties as well, because of their placement in Sthanas. And this was true for his Mercury period. He continued to be, you know, very successful movie star, creator, film director. You know, he started his own studio with some other United Artists was originally the film studio. He started with some other artists like Paula Goddard and D.W. Griffin and some others. But he was also dealing with a lot of court cases during this time, usually related to his scandalous relationship life. And actually, before this period was over, really sort of fell out of favor. He sort of had a fall during this time too, partly because of his sort of political views, and ended up leaving the country and settling in Switzerland. Yes, this Mercury continued to give Raja Yoga, but it gave some other things as well, and put him in a foreign country, as you can see how it could, given his rulership of the 12th. I'd have to go back and see the timing on that, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. So here's and the reason I wanted to talk about his chart, because this is obviously an interesting one to consider, given the fact that 3 planets are in MKS positions. So we're going to move on here. So any other thoughts with this regards to this chart before we do that? Okay. So now I'm going to pull up a chart. This is not a celebrity figure or anything. So wait a second, hold on. So what, if any, planets would be considered in your MCAS positions here?
Mercury.
Mercury would be. And how would you judge this particular Mercury here in terms of being some sort of problematic placement for Mercury with respect to the 7th house?
It's not a good planet for this Lagna.
So it's a functional malefic on this logna, and specifically why? I mean, what house is it
It
particularly?
rules the 8th house.
Eighth
Eighth
house,
house.
aspected by a malefic.
Right, so you've got Mercury here as the 8th lord, and it's in the 7th house. It's aspected by the natural malefic Mars, who besides being the Lagna lord is the 6th lord. Is there any positive influence on it?
Jupiter's aspect.
Jupiter's aspect, but why would Jupiter's aspect here maybe not reliably protect?
Retrograde. Mercury.
The fact that it's retrograde, right?
Yes.
Now, its dispositor obviously is this exalted Venus, actually well placed in the 5th house, but of course, and with some benefic influence as well, but also a retrograde Jupiter, and then also under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis. So, and this person, ran his Mercury period, as you can see. He ran his Mercury period from age 22 to age 39. So what Mercury could obviously and predictably, what could it give? What event could it very clearly and obviously give?
Marriage.
Yeah,
Marriage.
he did marry this period. But, and I'm not going to go into details here because this is a private individual, but he had a really bad traumatic experience with regards to his first marriage, and then did remarry, but my understanding is it's not been a good marriage, or he's not been happy in the marriage. So this is a situation where I believe Mercury in the 7th house does contribute as a MKS planet to, you might say, unfavorable experiences related to the 7th house, but not just because it's Mercury. It's Mercury because it's the 8th lord in the 7th with this affliction, right? And not really being protected as it otherwise might by a Jupiter that wouldn't be retrograde. And again, earlier on when he was first met, he just had a very, very bad experience that was rather traumatic for him. Again, I'm not at liberty to detail it. So this would be a situation where I believe Mercury as an MKS planet does contribute to unfavorable experiences related to the 7th house. Wouldn't invariably, but again, based on additional factors, yes. So now I want to pull up another chart.
Mark, what sort of results this Mercury will give otherwise? Would it give, because it's in a 7th house, it's a position giver, it's in a mutual aspect with Mars?
Well, it has another side to it, if that's what you're asking, right?
Yeah.
And so its mutual glance with Mars could be said to be forming what?
111 Dhan Yoga.
A 111 combination, right? It is, as you said, in the 7th house, which is 10th from the 10th. It can be a position giver. If you use it as a dasha lagna, then it forms some patterns that would be sort of considered favorable. And he did have a reasonably good, I would say, career progression or experience in the Mercury major period. Of course, I haven't looked at this in a long time. When that happens, some of that can be attributed not just, I think the Dasha Lagna or the D10 Lagna here might be actually Gemini, not Cancer, in which case, Mercury and even Ketu, the following period of Ketu, could have given some actually quite good results with respect to his career. Yeah, it's useful. You've all heard me say, and I can't repeat it enough, that whenever you see a planet, you always want to ask yourself the question, what's the best thing this placement of this planet can give? And then on the other side, what's, any kind of unfavorable things it can give? And it won't be one or the other, it'll be both. So I want to show this horoscope here. Again, this is not of some celebrity. It's actually just some chart that I've worked on and I've given a person input about. And they actually have been a student of mine. So what applies here, or could apply in terms of MKS?
Saturn and Moon.
Saturn, as in the first house, would actually qualify that way. And then what else?
Moon in the 8th house.
Moon in the 8th house, right. And what interested me in particular about this, if you look down at the Dasha sequence, is that from December 2020 up until later this month, July 23rd, they've been running their Saturn Moon period and sub-period. But just focus on one thing at a time here. So Saturn in the first house, since I've asked you to consider in what way it could be give any kind of good results, Saturn here could be said to be giving, from a favorable side, what kind of result?
Raja,
So,
what lord in the first house?
So it's a angle lord, fourth angle lord in the first house, a trine house. So this is Raja Yoga by placement. Well, let's start with the fact, what kind of planet is Saturn said to be in this chart? How would it be considered? Of course, it's a natural malefic, but how would it be considered in terms of based on its lordship?
neutral.
No.
Then a malefic.
Well, I would say a mild functional malefic, because it doesn't rule the angle, and the other Dushtana that it rules is the most. So we got conversations going in the background. You need to mute your mic if your background is not quiet. Thank you. So Saturn here is not considered the best of planets for this Lagna. Of course, it's also a natural malefic. Its conjunction in the Lagna obviously is a blemish on that, an affliction, you might say. What else is going on with this Saturn? Is it getting any connecting?
Mars.
Aspect of Mars.
So there's a mutual aspect between Saturn and Mars. And if we had to say, what could the good side of that be, what would you say?
It's causing a 1-4 Raja.
So they are forming an angle trine combination. And again, I'm struck by the degrees. Look at Saturn at 21, Mars at 21. The aspect could not be more exact. And Saturn Mars is coming up. What could the negative side of that be?
Some sort of Ava Yoga.
Some sort of what?
Not very good for health, maybe?
Yes.
It could have some negative implications about health, but what's interesting to consider about this is that would Mars's aspect onto Scorpio itself be considered bad for health?
No.
Why not?
It's looking at its own house.
Right, it's aspecting onto its own house, but Saturn in the Lagna, getting this additional aspect of Mars, that period and subperiod could have some unfavorable indications with regards to the health, but it also gives Raja Yoga. Mars by itself is what here? Well, what's Mars doing here that by itself that way?
It's
First
also
lord
the
in the 10th house.
Lord.
So, just when you've answered questions a couple of times, why don't you hang back and kind of let others get a turn as well. So Mars obviously is the first lord in the 10th with the 10th lord, is actually a very good 110 Raja Yoga in the 10th house. And something when I'm on this topic, I don't have the Jaimini Karakas here, but who's the planet with the highest degrees and who's the planet with the second highest degrees? So who's the AK and who's the AMK?
Sun and Mars.
Sun and Mars. So actually, this combination of Mars and the Sun, from a Gemini point of view, is an AK-AMK combination in the 10th house. And she's currently running Leo in Charadasha. And so she has been doing very well in her career. I've actually predicted career rise for her in combination with Saturn, Mars, in conjunction with what's going on in the Gemini system. And, for those who know the Gemini system, there's various ways in which we qualify Raja Yogas in both systems. One of them has to do with the strength of planets, but strength of planets do both the Sun and Mars have here. The Sun has an obvious one, folks, but what other source of strength does it have?
Directional strength,
And Mars
and also has directional strength.
Directional
Saturn
strength.
also has directional strength. And for those who know the Gemini system, how did this combination of the AK-AMK and the 10th house, how does it get additionally qualified based on some other Gemini concept that is a specific way to see if Gemini Raja Yogas get stabilized, to get an additional favorable factor, I just might say.
An Argala on the 11th house with Mercury exalted with no cancellation in the 3rd.
That's point one. Keep going.
In the aspect of Jupiter, a sign becomes strong when they have the aspect of Mercury or Jupiter. So in this case, we have a Rashi aspect of Jupiter onto Mars and Sun.
I'm glad you remember that, Katrina, but do you remember Trikona Argala? Trikona Argala?
Yes, also, yes. Mhm.
And then what's another principal Argala position from any sign? Not just the 11th house, but also the
Second, fourth, 11th.
Second and fourth.
right. So folks, I want people to see that this, for those who know the Gemini system, Leo is getting Shubha Argala from Mercury and Venus in the 2nd there, without any planets in the 12th in there, which would be Cancer, no obstruction. So it's an unobstructed Shubha Argala. The moon here forms unobstructed Argala, so there's no planets in the 3rd from Leo, which would be Libra. And then there's Jupiter forming a Trikona Argala, a benefic in one of the trions, while the other trion is empty, which would be Sagittarius. So my point is that this really substantial Gemini Raja Yoga forming in the 10th house of the birth chart gets these real supportive Argalas. And, it's on this basis, in conjunction with Saturn giving Raja Yoga and Saturn Mars in particular, that I've predicted good career rise during this time. Remains to be seen. But now, coming to the moon, because it is in the 8th house. And, what about this moon that could be considered quite unfavorable?
It's waning and it's debilitated in Naumansha.
So, well, I'm showing Dishamsha. Okay, so I might be confusing you there. It might be.
Yeah, sorry.
No, well, I've got the wrong chart up here. So it's not debilitated, but it's a dark waning moon. That's not a favorable point for the moon ever. And then, what else would you see about it that would not be considered good for the moon?
There aren't any planets in both sides.
So there's no planets that are forming or in houses on both sides of the moon, which would be Taurus and Cancer. And there's also no aspects to the moon itself, normal sort of aspects, conjunction or special aspects. Would it be considered a Chemadruma moon for that reason here? Is it truly a Chemadruma moon or not? And if so, why not?
No, Mark, because it has Venus and Mercury in a Kendra from it.
Right. So if there's planets in a Kendra from a moon with no planets on either side of it, particularly if those are benefics, and particularly if those benefics are strong, this is Chemadruma Banga, meaning it breaks that Chemadruma, and this is really not a Chemadruma moon at all. But it is the moon in the 8th house. And Moon's associative planets. It likes to be with other planets. That's the idea of Duradhara Yoga, meaning planets on both sides of the moon, and of Kamadruma Yoga, no planets on both sides of the moon. And look at the positional relationship. Obviously, it's Saturn to the moon. What's their positional relationship from each other to each other?
1-8.
1-8. And of course, if you use Chandralagna, she's running the major period of Saturn going into 6. So I was interested to see what this person's experience was in the Saturn moon period, particularly, you might say, emotionally. And as it turns out, this person is a Ukrainian person living and working in the US, married but divorced, with at least one child, maybe 2. And so she's like a single working mother, which is not an easy existence. And then, of course, she's Ukrainian and has many families, many friends and family members, extended family in Ukraine. And so obviously this Saturn moon period is equated to the time where Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the way in which what's going on in Ukraine and how many millions are being displaced and dying, and the cities are being destroyed. In an interesting twist of fate, her parents, who come to visit her from the Ukraine once a year, happen to be visiting with her when the war started. And, as a result, have not returned and may not return. And so essentially, basically her parents have moved in with her during this time, which she describes as being both a plus and not a plus. Certainly gives her help with the children and their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. So it was, period in some period that has been very emotional and emotionally difficult in a lot of different ways for the reasons that I described. So coming back to, do I believe this moon here in the 8th house in the way it is, it would be considered, sort of an MKS sort of planet that way? And my answer would be yes. The answer would be yes. Okay. So actually the only planet, MKS type planet that we've not looked at is one that I want to look at now with regards to this chart, which I made a prediction on that was one of the riskiest predictions I ever made, that actually are fortunate to come out. So where is this? Look at this Venus. It's in, of course, the MKS position, which would be the 6th house. What else is going on with it?
Affliction by Saturn and Mars.
It's the aspect of the 2 worst malefics, Saturn and Mars, and then also what's going on with it with respect to Mars, not just the mutual aspect.
It's in a parivartana. It's in an
Parivartana.
exchange.
It's in a parivartana yoga. Venus, of course, what kind of planet for this Gemini Lagna?
Very good planet.
Yeah, is considered to be the only functional benefic for anyone with, besides, Lagna Lord. So yes, this is, but it's, in the 6th house, it's heavily afflicted. Obviously it's Karaka of relationships. But what's good about, the 7th house, 7th Lord? I mean, when you consider a person's relationship karma, I always recommend you first consider Venus as Karaka, Venus being, something to evaluate as far as a person's love life, relationship life, both in the birth chart and in Navamsha. We see it's conditioned in the birth chart here. What happens to Venus in Navamsha and what repeats as an influence?
It's exalted.
First of all, the good thing is it's in its exaltation sign. What else? what repeats, what influence repeats from the birth lagna to in the Vamsha.
Saturn.
Aspect of Saturn.
Yeah, in both cases, get the aspect of Saturn. Now, consider the 7th house, 7th lord of the birth chart. What's good here, bad, or indifferent?
It's Jupiter, but it's retrograde.
Well,
But seventh lord is aspecting its own house in the 7th house.
right. So that's always a good thing, whether it's retrograde or direct, and particularly as a natural benefic aspecting back on its own 7th house, that's favorable. Lagna lord goes to the 7th. In such instances, a person just tends to be very relationship oriented. I mean, they really, it's important to them to be in a relationship. And the fact is that this woman was married for a long period of time. I forget about how long, but for a long period of time, but then did divorce and had not been in a relationship for a long time. I actually, I met this person when they started attending a satsanga that I hosted in my house on Thursday night at a time when we were actually studying Jyotish. And she was actually in her mid-60s at this time and was running Venus Rahu. Venus Rahu. And of course, what is Venus Rahu known for? One of the things that it's known for, or Rahu Venus.
Marriage.
Well, bringing a fated love affair into a person's life, oftentimes, not always, but I could show a lot of examples where it did in fact lead to a marriage or a marriage-like situation. And why does Rahu Venus in this particular chart show a specific additional potential for that?
Because in the Vamsha, Venus is the Lagna lord and Rahu is in the 7th house. So they're
That's
both
it.
related to this 1-7.
Yeah, that's it, Ekaterina. That's exactly it. And so, she was attending these, Thursday night sessions where I was, teaching Jyotish. And I think I started talking about Venus, Rahu, Venus. And she sort of raised her hand and said, well, I'm running Venus Rahu right now. Do you think it would bring a relationship into my life? I'd really like to remarry. And, if you look at the statistical chances of a woman unmarried in her mid-60s, the statistical chances for remarrying after that, they're like, astronomical. It just doesn't happen very frequently. It doesn't never happen, but it just, they're statistically a very low probability. But I, talked about how this is notorious for doing that and how it, in her chart, it kind of specifically shows that even more given the situation in Navamsha. And so I did predict that something definitely could happen this way. Long story short, a man did come into her life. There were some ups and downs. They were living with each other for a while, and then he decided he wasn't sure about, this is what he wanted to do, and he left the relationship for a period of time, but he came back, and they married in Venus-Jupiter, with Jupiter again being that 7th lord aspecting back onto its own 7th house. So, my point is that even with this Venus being as it is, which I think does suffer from MKS sort of situation here, especially given the influence of the additional malefic, it was in a major period that got her married against all odds and remains happily married to this day. So kind of a very interesting story that I wanted to tell with respect to this particular. So really, folks, this is all that I had to share with you today. Any thoughts and questions that you'd like to ask with respect to this particular article?
I have a question, Mark. Can we see this MKS system from Moon Lagna also, or only from Lagna?
My understanding is that it only should be considered from the birth Lagna, not from the moon. But that's what's given in the Shastra, right? So my understanding, it only should be considered from the birth Lagna.
I have one
Mark?
question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Amita, why don't you, and then we'll go Dr. Rohit. Go ahead, Amita.
Mark, my question is regarding your experience and your observation regarding exalted planets in the Marana Karaka in the 7th house. In terms of relationship, what I have observed, it does give it, but it hampers it as well. And we did see like Charlie Chaplin's was the one, and there was Maharishi Yogi's was the first two were. But I just wanted to know your observation in terms of exaltation of planets in the 7th house and being in Marana Karaka.
So you're well, if you've got Mercury's MKS is the 7th house, but for Pisces, if you have Mercury as the 7th Lord exalted in the 7th house, unless there's afflictions or other problems going on, that would be considered, again, an excellent placement for giving good 7th house results. Now, when you think, again, whether an exalted planet, sort of like exalted malefics, I gave examples in the chart of exalted Mars in the 7th. And, the fact that it's exalted didn't seem to be useful or helpful at all with regards to Mars being, giving MKS type of results and Kuja dosha type results. So, again, you can't generalize. I mean, it is my experience. This is what I end up saying over and over again, because if you could do, you'll go wrong. You have to sort of see the whole picture and synthesize that. If you're asking me, do I think an exalted sun in the chart of Charlie Chaplin contributed to his relationship problems? Actually, I would say no, not at all. It contributed to the Dan yogas that formed there that resulted in him at one point being one of the highest paid people in the world. That's my view. Rohit, I think you had a question.
Mark, it may not be related to what we're discussing, but it's related to this chart that is right in the front.
Okay.
Would you, do you know anything how Venus, Mars, and Venus, Saturn went for this lady?
No, it's a good question, but my answer is I don't.
Okay, all right, no problem.
She wasn't in a relationship during that time. In fact, she wasn't in a relationship she wasn't in a relationship for some time. I mean, she was married for 18 years, divorced, and then was single, not because she wanted to be, for a long, long time, up until, Venus Rahu. But I just don't have any information about what specifically that period and sub-period gave.
Okay. The reason I ask is all these planets are giving Viparit Raj Yoga.
Well, yeah, I guess to some degree. No, I wouldn't disagree with that. No, she was successful in her career life. I mean, not extraordinarily. So she was a psychotherapist, and she was involved in the healing arts, which can be shown by these combinations along the 6-12 axes. And she was having, she was being successful, not renowned or especially anything like that, but she had a successful career in that capacity. So.
Yeah. No, I just thought I ask, because, the Venus results will come in Saturn and Mars Antradasha.
Sure. Unless there's any other thoughts or questions, we'll end with our Sanskrit prayer. Ahom Vasato Ma Sadgamaya, Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityor Ma Mritam Gamaya, Sarvesham Swasti Bhavatu, Sarvesham Shanti Bhavatu, Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu, Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu, Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu, Om Shanti, 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Be well, everyone. Let's all pray for world peace. It's much needed. Namaste and bye for now.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.